Good evening, good day. Page 154. They sought a new stimulus for socially useful labor. They thought originally it would be found in conscientiousness and enthusiasm, along with material disinterestedness, and that is why they seized so eagerly on a great example of the Subotnik, voluntary Saturdays. Saturdays, Subota in Russian. So a person of the Saturdays, Niki, just like Kulachnik is a person who helped the kulaks, if you remember way back in book 1. Anyway. But this turned out not to be the beginning of a new era, but a tremor of self-sacrifice on the part of one of the last generations of the revolution. It can be seen, for example, from the provincial materials in Tambov that in 1921 many members of the party were already trying to get out of the Subotniki. And a mark was introduced in the party record book for participation in Subotniki. Sorry. Yes, this outburst lasted another decade, enough for the Komsomolets and us, the young pioneers of those times. But then it came to an end for us too. And what was next? Where was the stimulus to be sought? Money, peace rates, bonus payments. But all of that carried the acrid smell of recent capitalism, and a long period was required. Another generation for that smell to cease to irritate, so it could be peaceably accepted as the socialist principle of material incentive. Socialist principle of material incentive. It dug down deeper into the storage chest of history and dragged out what Marx had called extra-economic coercion. In camp and on collective farms, this discovery was presented with bared fangs. Interesting, we haven't heard that. I haven't heard that term. Interesting. In camp and on collective farms, this discovery was presented with bared fangs. And then Frankel came along, and like a devil sprinkling a poison potion into the boiling cauldron, he poured in the differentiated ration pot. There was a famous incantation repeated over and over again. In the new social structure, there can be no place for the discipline of the stick on which serfdom is based, nor the discipline of starvation on which capitalism is based. Unquote. And there you are. The archipelago managed miraculously to combine the one and the other. All in all, the particular techniques required for this totaled 3. 1, the differentiated ration pot. 2, the brigade. And 3, 2 sets of bosses. But the third of these was not absolutely necessary. At Vorkuta, for example, there was only one set of bosses, and things hummed. And so it was that the archipelago rested on these 3 whales, these 3 pillars. Baby! Or, if one considers them the driving belts, they certainly made the wheels turn. We have already explained about the differentiated ration pot. This was a redistribution of bread and cereals aimed at making our Zek beat his head against the wall and break his back for the average prisoner's ration, which, in parasitical societies, is issued to an inactive prisoner to fix it so that Averbakh could get his own lawful ration, only in extra dollops of 3.5 ounces, and by being considered a shock worker, percentages of output above 100 conferred the right to supplementary spoonfuls of kasha, those previously taken away, of course. What a merciless known edge of human nature. What a merciless knowledge of human nature, sorry. Neither those pieces of bread nor those cereal patties were comparable with the expenditure of strength that went into earning them, but as one of his eternal disastrous traits of a human being is capable, as one of his traits, the human being is incapable of grasping the ratio of an object to its price. For a cheap glass of vodka, a soldier is roused to attack in a war not his own, and lays down his life. In the same way, the Zek, for those pauper's handouts, slips off a log, gets dunked in the icy freshness of a northern river, or needs clay for mud huts barefoot in icy water. And because of those feet are never going to reach the land of freedom. However, the satanical differentiated ration pot was not all-powerful. Not everyone took the bait, just as serfs at one time or another grasped the truth that you may have to eat less, but at least you won't have to break your back working. So the Zeks, too, understood it. In camp, it was not the small ration that killed people, but the big one. Lazy, stupid, indefensible, half-animated people. Half-animated, insensible, half-animated. They don't want that supplementary allotment of rations. They don't want a piece of that nourishing bread made from a mix of potatoes, veg, and water. They don't want to be released ahead of term. They don't even want to be posted on the Board of Honor. They don't want to rise to the interests of the construction project and the country. They don't want to fulfill the 5-year plans, even though the 5-year plans are in the interests of the workers. They wander about the nooks and crannies of the mines, of the floors of construction projects, and they are delighted to hide from the rain in a dark hole, just anything, in order not to work. Not often is it possible to arrange such mass labor projects as in the gravel pit near Yaroslavl. There, hundreds of prisoners are clumped together in a small area visible to the naked eyes of the supervisors, and hardly has any one of them stopped moving, then he is immediately conspicuous. These are ideal conditions. No one even dares to slow down, to straighten his back, to wipe off the sweat, until up on the hill the flag drops, the signal for a smoking period. How then is it to be managed in other cases? Much thought was applied, and the brigade was invented. Yes, and for that matter, how could we fail to invent it in our country? Even the Narodniki, the populists, wanted to enter into socialism through Obshchina, the peasant commune, and into socialism, and the Marxists through the collective. And what do our newspapers even write nowadays? Quote, the main thing for a human being is work, and it must be work in a collective. Unquote. And in camp there is nothing but work, and only in a collective. Does that mean that a corrective labor camp is the highest goal of humanity? That the main thing has been attained? How the brigade serves the psychological enrichment of its members, the prattling, the surveillance, and the heightened sense of dignity we have already had cause to explain in Chapter 3, consistent with the purpose of the brigade, worthy tasks, and brigadiers, known in camp lingo as the bukri, in other words, lumps, are selected, slave driving the prisoners with club and ration. The brigadier has to cope with the brigade in the absence of the higher-ups, the supervisors, and the convoy. Shalamov cites examples in the whole membership of the brigade. Died several times over in the course of one gold-washing season on the Kolym, but the brigadier remained the same. That was a kind of brigadier. Paralamov was Kamerlay. He did not use his tongue, merely his stave. The list of these names would take up many pages here, but I have not compiled it. It is of interest that this kind of brigadier most often came from the thieves, that is, from the lumpen proletariat. Great order. Lumpen proletariat. I think that's what you call the protesters. The blue hair. However, what is there to which people cannot adapt? It would be crude on our part not to look closely and observe how the brigade sometimes became a natural constituent cell of the native society of the archipelago, of the same kind that the family is in freedom. I myself knew such brigades, and more than one too. True, these were not brigades on general work, where someone had to die because otherwise the rest could not survive. These were usually special brigades, electricians, lathe operators, carpenters, painters, few of their members, some 10 to 12 persons. The more clearly the principle of mutual protection and mutual support appeared in them. For such a brigade and for such a role, there also has to be a suitable brigadier, moderately hard, well acquainted with all the moral laws of GULag and immoral, perspicacious and fair within the brigade, with his own well-worked-out method of coping with the higher-ups, whether it be a hoarse bark or a quiet and underhanded approach. He had to be feared by all the trustees, and let no opportunity go by to grab off for the brigade an extra 3.5 ounces, padded trousers, a pair of shoes. But he also had to have connections among the influential trustees from whom he could learn all the camp news and impending changes. He needed this for corrective leadership. He had to know work well in the sectors which were advantageous and disadvantageous, and be adept at shoving the neighboring brigade, if there was a neighboring brigade, onto the disadvantaged sectors, with a sharp eye out for the chances for tukta, and sensing where best to grab it off with a particular 5-day work period, whether through manipulating work norms or total volume, and defend this unwaveringly against the work assigner, when the latter was already waiting with the splattering fountain pen to cut back the worksheets, and adroit at greasing the paw of the norm setter, and knowing who in his brigade was a stoolie, and if the stoolie was not very smart or malicious, and leaving him alone, since otherwise they'd send him a worse one. And he always had to know whom in the brigade he should encourage with a glance, whom to curse out, and whom to give a lighter job on that particular day. And a brigade like that, with a brigadier like that, adapts itself to austerity and survives austerely. There is no tenderness here, but no one dies. I worked with brigadiers like that, with Zinabryukov, and Pavel Baranyuk. And if I were to compile a list of others like them, it would be many pages long, and on the basis of many different stories. There is a consensus that such efficient and intelligent brigadiers most often originated from among the kulak sons. But what was there to do if they implacably forced the brigade on the Zeks as a form of existence? Then what was to be done? It was necessary somehow to adapt to it, was it not? We will die from this work, but we are able to survive only by working. Of course, this is a questionable philosophy. A better answer would be, don't teach me to die the way you want, but let me die the way I want. But they won't allow you to anyway. That's what. And the choice of facing brigadier could be difficult also, if the logging brigade failed to fulfill the day's norms. The day's norm of 72 cubic yards, the brigadier went into the punishment block too, and if you don't want to go to the punishment block, then drive your brigade members to their deaths. Bow down to the stronger. And the two sets of bosses were also convenient, in just the same way that pliers need both a right and a left jaw. Two bosses, these were the hammer and the anvil. They hammered out of the exec what the state required, and when he broke, they brushed him into the garbage bin. Even though the maintenance of a separate administration for the camp compound greatly increased the state's expenditures, and even if out of stupidity, caprice, and vigilance, it often complicated the working process. Nevertheless, they put it there anyway, and this was no mistake. Two bosses. This was two tormentors instead of one, in shifts too, and placed in a situation of competition to see who could squeeze more out of the prisoner and give him less. Production materials. 2. Transportation. Were in the hands of one boss. All that was lacking was manpower. Manpower was brought in every morning by convoy from the camp and taken away to the camp every evening or in shifts. During those 10 or 12 hours during which the Zeks were in the hands of the production bosses, there was no need to educate them or correct them, and even if they dropped dead during the course of the workday, this wouldn't disappoint either administration. Corpses could be written off more easily than burned up boards or stolen linseed oil. It was important for the production bosses to compel the prisoners to do more work in a day and to credit them with less work in their sheets, because it was necessary to make up somehow for all the fatal over-expenditures and shortages on the production side, because the trusts were engaged in stealing, and so were the Constitution, and so were the construction and installation administration, and the construction superintendents, and the foremen, and the work site superintendents, and the truck drivers, and the Zeks least of all, and then not for themselves, for they had nowhere to take the stuff, but for their camp chiefs and their convoy. And still more than all of that put together was lost through careless and negligent management, and also because the Zeks didn't take good care of anything either, and there was just one way to make up for all these shortages: underpayment for manpower. The camp administration, on the other hand, controlled the workforce alone. Repstila, and the tongue certainly knows how to abbreviate. But this was the decisive factor. The camp chiefs, in fact, used to say, "We can squeeze them," the production administration. because they can't find other workers anywhere else. Where could you find manpower in the taiga and the desert? Consequently, they sought to squeeze more money out in return for their repsila, which in part was turned over to the government, but in part went for the maintenance of the camp administration itself in return for guarding the Zeks from freedom, providing them with food and drink, dressing them, and morally harassing them. Excuse me. Just as always in our well-thought-out social system, two different plans collided head-on here too. The production plan, whose object was to have the lowest possible expenditures for wages, and the MVD plan, whose objective was to extract the largest possible earnings from camp production. To an observer on the sidelines, it seems strange. Why set one's own plans in conflict with one another? Oh, but there was a profound meaning in it. Conflicting plans flatten the human being. This is a principle which far transcends the barbed wire of the archipelago. You're crazy. And what is also important is that these two sets of bosses are by no means hostile to each other, as one might think from their constant squabbles and mutual deceits. Where it is necessary to flatten someone thoroughly, they close ranks very tightly, and even though the camp chief is the Zek's dear father, yet he always willingly recognizes and signs an official affidavit that the Zek himself was to blame for his own injury and not the contractor. He will not be very insistent on the Zeks having work clothes, nor demand ventilation in some section of a plant where there is none. Well, if there isn't, there isn't, and what can you do? These are temporary difficulties. And what about the siege of Leningrad? The camp chief will never refuse the production boss when he is asked to jail a brigadier in the punishment block for rudeness, or a worker for having lost a shovel, or an engineer who hasn't carried out an order the way he should have. Did both of these chiefs constitute the cream of society in remote settlements? Were they not the serf holders of taiga industry? And didn't their wives call on one another? If, nonetheless, there is incessant tukta in padded work, if there is a constant adaptation to trenches dug and filled which never yawned in the earth's surface. Repair of heating systems or lathes which were never out of order, replacement of perfectly sturdy pots which will be standing there for another 10 years. This is done not at the instigation of the camp chiefs, who are quite calm and confident that the money will flow to the camp one way or another anyway, but by the Zeks themselves, brigadiers, norm setters, foremen, because all state work norms are the same. They are calculated not for real life on this earth, but for some kind of earthly ideal on the moon. A human being dedicated, self-sacrificing, healthy, well-nourished, and energetic is incapable of fulfilling these norms. And so what are you going to get out of a fagged-out, weak, hungry, and downtrodden convict? The state system of setting work norms prescribes an output if possible on this planet, and in a sense resembles socialist realm in bell letters. But if the unsold books are easily shredded later, it is more complicated to cover up industrial tukta. However, it is not impossible. In their constant tail-chasing haste, the director and the construction superintendent have, let's say, overlooked or missed noticing, failed to discover the tukta and the free foreman were either illiterate or drunk, or else well disposed to the decks, with the expectation, of course, that in a difficult moment the deck brigadier would help them out. And by then the percentage of bonus had been eaten up, and you couldn't pull the bread back out of the belly. Accountants, inspection, and audits are notorious for their clumsiness. They turn up after a delay of months or years, and the money paid out for the work has long since flitted away, and all that can still be done is to bring charges against one of the free employees, or else smudge it up and write it off. Thank you for listening. Have a good day.